Imagine opening your eyes for the very first time. No memories, no assumptions, no context, just the world, raw, unexplained, incomprehensible. For a brief moment, everything is extraordinary. The color of the sky, the shape of your hands, the sensation of breath filling your lungs. But this feeling does not last. Wonder is fragile, and soon the extraordinary becomes ordinary. You stop noticing, you stop asking why, because to wonder is to be vulnerable. To question the world is to admit you do not understand it, and ignorance is uncomfortable. So, you build a fortress of certainty. You name the things around you. You call this a tree, you call this water, you call it reality. But what if it isn't? What if the world is not as obvious as it seems? What if you have been sleepwalking through something far more profound? Philosophy begins when you stop taking the world for granted, when you look at reality as if for the first time. This is the Garden of Eden, not just the paradise of religious texts, but the state of wonder, the moment when the world is strange and you're awake. But humans are not content with wonder. They are not content to gaze in awe. They demand knowledge. They demand certainty. And so they name the world. They classify it. They turn the unknown into familiar. But this naming in itself is a kind of forgetting. The moment you call the sky sky, you stop seeing its vastness. The moment you call the ground solid, you forget the billions of nothingness trembling beneath your feet. To name something is to strip it of its mystery. And in doing so, we lost the garden. Our wonder faded in the quest for knowledge. To survive is to focus, to prioritize, to ignore. But to sleepwalk through life is not to live it. Philosophers are those who refuse to sleepwalk. They return to the garden. They question what others accept. What is the nature of reality? What does it mean to exist? These are not idle questions nor distractions. They are the only questions that matter. To ask these questions is to be human. To stop asking is to forget what you are. Most people live with this forgetting. They grow older, but not wiser. They know the price of everything and the value of nothing. They are born into the garden and they are cast out. But the garden is not lost. It is not a place. It is a state of mind. And you can return. All it takes is a question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Reality is the oldest trick in the book, and you are the audience. You sit quietly, watching, nodding, accepting, because that is what you were told to do, to trust what you see, to believe what you hear, to call this world real because everyone else does. But what if it's all just a performance? Imagine a magician, a black top hat resting on a polished stage. He reaches inside and pulls out a rabbit. The audience gasps, they applaud, but no one asks, where did the rabbit come from? Where was it before? This is how people see the world. As a trick, a spectacle to be observed, not questioned. Consider this. Atoms are composed of electrons, electrons composed of quarks, quarks composed of nothing. They have no known internal structure. How can that be? How can something come from nothing? You accept the existence of reality, but you can't explain it, and you are not alone. Philosophers have been staring from the rabbit's fur for thousands of years. They build theories, invent stories, they call it science, they call it faith. But deep down, they know the rabbit should not exist, and neither should they. You believe you were born into a world that makes sense, a world of order, a world of rules. But order is a lie. The world is not neat, it is not stable, it is chaos, dressed in illusion. Like the magician's trick, you see only the ending. You miss what came before. You miss what lies underneath. But what would happen if you started looking inside the hat? You would see it for what it is, not a trick, not magic, just the unknown. And the unknown is terrifying. It has no shape, no answers, no meaning. You stare into it, and it stares back. This is why you look away, why you cling to the illusion, why you pretend the trick is real. But reality does not care what you believe. It does not care that you feel safe. It only is. You must decide whether to look. The simple fact that you're here means that you're not satisfied. You feel it. You wonder. You wonder, not because you want to, but because you cannot stop. But wonder comes with a cost. To look beyond the trick is to risk madness, to pull apart reality and find nothing. Are you ready for that? Or will you sit back down and pretend the trick is real? We're going to slowly unravel these questions by taking a descent through the history of thought, where reality bends and your certainty crumbles. You're part of the trick, looking up, trying to catch a glimpse of the great illusionist. This is where our journey begins. We've taken our first steps back into the garden, but ahead lies a deeper descent through the labyrinth of human thought. We'll encounter the raw power of myth in Thor, where gods personified nature's fury, the relentless inquiry of Socrates, who dismantled certainty with a single question, the vision of Jesus, who redefined existence itself, the cold elegance of Charles Darwin, and many, many more. Each figure offers fractures and cracks in the illusion we call reality. Chapter 2: The Myths. Imagine a world where every gust of wind is a whisper from the gods, where the sky is not just empty space, but a battlefield of titans. In the myths of ancient cultures, reality was not observed, it was lived. And in Norse mythology, few tales reflect the human struggle to understand existence better than those of Thor, Loki, and the realms of Asgard, Midgard, and Utgard. Midgard was the world of men, familiar, solid, and precariously perched between the divine and the chaotic. Above it loomed Asgard, the home of the gods, where power and order reigned. Beyond both lay Utgard, the land of giants, a realm of wild, untamable forces. These three worlds mirrored the human condition, caught between the comfort of meaning and the terror of the unknown. Thor was the protector of Midgard, wielding Mjolnir to keep the chaos of Utgard at bay. Yet even gods were not immune to deception. When Thor's hammer was stolen by the giant Thrym, the price for its return was unthinkable. Thor had to dress as a woman and marry the very giant who stole it. With Loki at his side, disguised as a handmaiden, Thor swallowed his pride, donned a bridal gown, and played the role. But when the moment came, when Mjolnir was placed in his lap as part of the wedding ceremony, Thor cast aside the illusion. With a single blow, he shattered the farce and slaughtered his captors. It is a story of power reclaimed, but also of the lengths to which one must go to confront the unknown. Thor's humiliation, his willingness to embody what he was not, reflects humanity's eternal struggle with vulnerability. To understand the world, we must sometimes become strangers to ourselves. But myth is not merely about gods and battles, it is about meaning. In the kidnapping of Thor's wife, Sif, whose golden hair symbolized the harvest, we see the fear of scarcity. When Loki sheared her hair in a cruel joke, the world was cast into turmoil until he, under threat of death, commissioned the dwarves to forge new strands of gold. In this tale, the chaos of mischief, the order of craftsmanship, and the compromise of consequence all echo the human need to find balance in a world that feels beyond control. And Loki, the trickster who danced between gods and giants, friend and foe, his very nature defied labels. He was the question that could never be answered, the embodiment of uncertainty. Is it any wonder that in almost every myth, Loki is both the cause and the solution to the gods' troubles? He represents the mind itself, curious, unpredictable, and often its own worst enemy. But myths were never just stories. They were the first thought experiments. If they explored why the world is chaotic, why good suffers alongside evil, and why the sky does not fall, they were humanity's attempt to hold the universe in their hands, to believe that thunder could be tamed with a name and that chaos could be reasoned with through ritual. But here's the question. If the gods are just reflections of us, what does that say about the world we created? Myths gave us a narrative for the incomprehensible. They placed us at the center of the storm. In the story of Thor and Loki's journey to Utgard, where illusions deceived even the gods, the lesson was clear. Reality is not what it seems. When Thor tried to lift a cat and failed, it was no cat, it was the Midgard serpent in disguise. When Loki lost an eating contest, he was competing against fire itself. The giants laughed, the gods were humbled, and for the first time they saw the limits of their own power. What if reality is not just more complicated than we understand, but more complicated than we can understand? Myths did not die because they were disproven. They faded because we stopped needing them. As human thought evolved, so did our need for different kinds of explanations. The gods were no longer enough. Stories could not measure the movement of stars or the flow of time. We needed something more. But myths were never about measurement. They were about meaning. They were reflections, mirrors held up to the human condition. They whispered of chaos barely held at bay, of power lurking in the unknown. To believe in gods and monsters was to believe that the world was alive, that every storm had a motive, every dawn a meaning. In their eyes, the universe was not a machine, cold and indifferent, but a story, one where the human mind played a crucial role. Yet the very power of myth contained its own undoing. The moment humans could shape gods in their image, they could question them. If thunder was Thor's wrath, why did it strike the innocent? If fate wove the world, could its threads be cut? As the stories grew, so did the cracks in their certainty. The same minds that once worshipped the sky would one day seek to understand it, not through prayer, but through reason. Myths gave birth to meaning, but could meaning exist without them? If the gods were gone, what remained? The natural philosophers would look at the world with fresh eyes. They would not see gods in the thunder, but patterns, laws, order. They would ask questions that myths could never answer. This was the birth of human reasoning. Chapter 3: The Natural Philosophers. For the first time, the gods fell silent. The storm still roared, but no divine hand guided the thunder. No hammer swung in the sky. No trickster wove illusions in the clouds. What remained was not a world of spirits, but a world of things: earth, water, air, fire. Matter, shifting and shaping itself, not by will, but by something else, something deeper. The natural philosophers of ancient Greece were the first to strip the world of its myths and stare into the void they left behind. They did not see gods in the lightning, nor spirits in the rivers. They saw patterns, principles, a reality governed not by stories, but by laws. And that changed everything. But if the gods were gone, what ruled in their place? The first questions. Thales of Miletus lived in a world still drenched in myth. The people around him believed the universe was crafted by gods, but Thales was unsatisfied. He did not ask, who made the world? He asked, what is the world? This was a break in human thought unlike any before it. It was not a rejection of myth. It was an evolution of it. If stories had once given meaning to existence, Thales sought something greater, a unity beneath it all. He proposed that everything, no matter how different it seemed, could be traced back to a single origin, a fundamental substance. And he believed that substance was water. Why water? Because water was everywhere. It could be solid, liquid, or gas. It could move, shape, and nourish. It could be the still ocean, the raging storm, the gentle rain. To Thales, this was the key. Everything changed. But if there was one thing that could change and remain, that was it. This was the first recorded attempt to explain the world without gods. A single thought that would fracture reality as humanity knew it. But if the world was made of water, where did thought come from? Anaximenes, a student of Thales, took the idea further. He argued that no, the fundamental substance was not water, but air. Breathe it in and you live. Take it away and you die. It was movement itself, change in motion. But it was Heraclitus who delivered the most radical answer. To him, the mistake was not in what the world was made of, but in thinking it could ever be one thing at all. Everything flows, he declared. No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river. and he is not the same man. Reality to Heraclitus was not a thing. It was a process, a fire constantly consuming and recreating itself. Nothing was fixed. To see the world as stable was an illusion. The only constant was change itself. But if everything was in flux, how could anything be understood? The search for order. Not everyone accepted the chaos of Heraclitus. Parmenides, his great rival in thought, saw things differently. He looked at the world and declared something shocking. Change does not exist. He argued that if something changes, it must come from nothing, and nothing, by definition, does not exist. Therefore, change is impossible. The world must be still, unchanging, eternal. The senses lie. Motion is an illusion. If Heraclitus was the voice of fire, Parmenides was the voice of stone. One saw the universe as an endless transformation, the other as an unshaken reality beneath the illusion of movement. Who was right? It was Empedocles who stepped between them and gave an answer that still echoes today. Perhaps the mistake was thinking reality was one thing at all. What if the world was made of many things? Empedocles proposed that everything, fire, water, earth, air, was made of four fundamental elements. They did not disappear. They did not come from nothing. They only combined and separated in endless cycles. The world was not born from gods, nor was it fixed in place. It was a great mixture, ruled by two cosmic forces, love, which brought things together, and strife, which tore them apart. For the first time, the world was seen not as a story or a single flow, but as a system, a framework where chaos and order, creation and destruction were part of the same dance. But if nature was governed by forces, what were they really? The hidden numbers. Then came Pythagoras. To him, the philosophers before him were all blind. They searched for the substance of the world, the materials that built it, but he saw deeper. The world was not made of water or air or fire, it was made of numbers. Everything could be measured, calculated, predicted. The movement of the stars, the harmony of music, even the structure of the human body. Beneath it all, there was mathematics. For Pythagoras, numbers were not just tools, they were the secret language of reality. He and his followers discovered that simple ratios could create beauty in sound, that geometry could explain the very fabric of space. It was the first glimpse into something even greater than gods or matter, the idea that reality itself was governed by logic. But logic alone could not explain everything. Numbers were precise, but they were cold. They could predict, but could they explain? If reality was built on numbers, why did it feel so alive? The birth of a new worldview. The natural philosophers shattered the illusions of myth, but they did not strip the world of wonder. They replaced gods with forces, stories with laws. And yet, in that search for something deeper, they did what no storyteller before them had done. They asked not just what the world was, but why it worked the way it did. With each question, they uncovered a new layer of reality. The belief that everything was made of water became the belief that everything was a flow. The belief in change led to the belief in structure. The belief in structure led to the belief in numbers, and with each step, they peeled back the surface of existence and found something astonishing. Beneath all of it, the world was still a mystery. But now, it was a mystery that could be unraveled. The gods were gone. But for the first time, humans realized something extraordinary. They could think for themselves. But if the world was made of elements, if it moved by forces, if it could be understood through numbers, what was it really made of? Could everything be broken down even further? One philosopher believed it could. He imagined a world not of endless transformation, but of tiny, indivisible building blocks. Pieces of reality so small they could never be broken apart. His name was Democritus, and he would be the first to see what no one else could. The atom. Chapter 4. Democritus and the Invisible Reality. For centuries, philosophers had searched for the fundamental nature of reality. Was it water, air, fire? Was it numbers, forces, or a grand cosmic mixture? Each answer brought a new question. Each certainty unraveled under deeper scrutiny. And then came a man who proposed something so radical, so alien to the thinking of his time, that it would take over 2,000 years before science caught up. His name was Democritus, and he saw what no one else could. The thought that shattered reality. Imagine holding a stone in your hand. If you break it in two, you still have stone. Break it again and again, smaller and smaller, but does it ever stop? Can you divide something forever? Democritus didn't think so. He argued that if you kept cutting, there must come a point where division is no longer possible, a point where you reach something so small, so fundamental that it cannot be split further. He called these tiny, indivisible pieces atoms, from the Greek atomos, meaning uncuttable. And in that single thought, the world changed. Because if everything could be broken down into atoms, then all of reality, every mountain, every ocean, every living being, was built from the same invisible building blocks. The differences between a rock, a tree, and a person were not because they were made of different substances, but because their atoms were arranged in different ways. And if that was true, then the universe was not a creation of divine forces or mystical energies. It was a vast, ceaseless interplay of countless tiny particles. But Democritus asked an even deeper question. If everything is made of atoms, where do they exist? What is between them? His answer was as bold as it was unsettling. Nothing. Between every atom was empty space, a void, infinite and endless, stretching between the building blocks of reality. Without it, movement would be impossible. Without it, atoms would have no room to combine, separate, and create the world. This shattered an ancient assumption. For centuries, thinkers had argued that nothing could not exist, that nature abhorred a vacuum. But Democritus insisted, the void was not an absence, but a necessary part of existence. Without emptiness, there could be no form. Without nothing, there could be no something. It was a terrifying thought, because if reality was just atoms and void, where did the soul fit in? The death of the soul. To the people of Democritus' time, the soul was not a metaphor. It was a force, something real, something divine. It gave life. It carried a person beyond death. It was the unseen essence of what it meant to exist. But Democritus believed otherwise. If everything was made of atoms, then the soul must be as well. He argued that the mind, emotions, even consciousness itself were simply the movement of tiny, smooth, round atoms flowing through the body like a kind of fire. And what happened when the body died? The soul atoms scattered, the pattern dissolved. Consciousness, like a flame snuffed out, was gone. This was not just a rejection of myth, it was a rejection of immortality itself. There was no afterlife, no divine judgment, only atoms rearranging, forming, dissolving, endlessly reshaping into new things. It was a worldview utterly indifferent to human longing. And it was one of the most terrifying ideas ever proposed. If reality was just atoms and void, then what of the gods? What of fate, destiny, divine will? Democritus had an answer, and it was as radical as the rest of his thinking. There are no gods controlling the world. No plan, no grand design. Only atoms moving according to necessity. The universe was not created, it simply was. Atoms collided, combined, and separated through endless motion, forming the stars, the earth, and everything within it. There was no higher meaning, no cosmic intention, just cause and effect. It was the first fully materialist view of the universe. And it meant that human beings were not part of a divine story. They were patterns in the dust. But does that mean life was meaningless? The laughing philosopher. Democritus did not despair at his own conclusions. In fact, he became known as the laughing philosopher, a man who met life's absurdity with joy, not sorrow. If the universe was without purpose, then purpose was something humans had to create for themselves. If the gods were illusions, then humanity was free from their whims. If death was final, then the only meaning was the one found in this life, in this moment. That meaning was happiness. True happiness, he believed, did not come from wealth, power, or superstition. It came from inner balance, from understanding the world as it was, rather than as one wished it to be, from embracing the randomness of existence rather than fearing it, from finding joy in thought, curiosity, and simple pleasures. To laugh at the absurdity of life was not to dismiss it, it was to accept it fully. The first glimpse of the modern world. The ideas of Democritus would be ridiculed, ignored, and buried for centuries. They were too alien, too cold, too unsettling for a world still clinging to gods and purpose. Aristotle dismissed him. Plato refused to even mention his name. But history has a way of catching up. Over 2,000 years later, in laboratories instead of temples, with equations instead of myths, humanity would rediscover the truth Democritus had glimpsed in the void. The universe was made of atoms. The void did exist. He claimed there was no divine plan guiding it all. But his most important insight was not just about atoms. It was about what happens when we dare to see reality as it truly is. Without gods, without myths, without fear. And in doing so, perhaps, to laugh. The next step. But if the universe was a vast, indifferent mechanism, what did that mean for the human experience? Were we bound by the same necessity that governed the atoms, or did we still have the power to choose? One of the oldest questions in human history was about to take center stage, the question of fate. Fate and the thread of time. After asking what the world is made of, philosophy had to face its next question. Do we shape our lives, or are they shaped for us? The invisible hand, the ancient answer to every unanswerable question. Why does the sun rise? Why does the crop fail? Why does a child die while a tyrant lives? Because the fates have woven it so. To the earliest human minds, the world was not governed by chance or logic, but by a pattern, predetermined and unchangeable. This belief wasn't superstition, it was survival. In Greek myth, the Moirai, the Fates, were three goddesses who spun, measured, and cut the thread of each life. Clotho spun the thread, Lachesis measured its length, and Atropos, with her shears, was decided when it ended. Even Zeus, king of the gods, could not defy them. The message was clear. You can run, you can hide, but you cannot escape what was written. And yet, within this terrifying certainty was also a kind of comfort. If everything was fated, then nothing was accidental. No suffering was without reason. No life without design. The Norse had the Norns, the Egyptians Shai and Renanudit. Every great culture wove fate into its story. Because to imagine a world ruled by chaos was worse than one ruled by cruel order. But the question lingered, if all is fated, what becomes of choice? The thought that divides us. The Greeks did not agree on the matter. Some schools, like the Stoics, embraced fate fully. They believed the universe was governed by logos, a rational principle, and that true freedom was accepting one's place within that order. Others, like the Epicureans, argued for chance. They believed atoms could swerve randomly, introducing uncertainty and thus freedom. In this swerve, they found room for choice. And then came the dramatists. In the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, fate was the invisible wall that no hero could escape. Oedipus flees the prophecy that he'll kill his father and marry his mother, only to fulfill it by trying to avoid it. His story wasn't about evil, it was about inevitability, that even a good man with noble intentions could be trapped by a fate written long before he was born. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were warnings that knowledge alone does not bring freedom, that even the act of resisting our fate may be what ensures it. But others asked, what if fate is simply what we don't yet understand? As philosophy matured, so did the idea of fate. No longer just threads spun by goddesses, it became a question of causality. If every effect has a cause, and every cause was caused by something before it, then isn't the future already determined? And if that's true, is the will free or merely another effect in a long chain? It is the same thought that would haunt science centuries later. In a fully mechanistic universe governed by laws and particles, what room is left for choice? Are we not just atoms in motion? This tension between fate and freedom became the pulse of philosophical inquiry. And the greatest thinkers knew it could not be answered with certainty, only explored, wrestled with, questioned. Because what we call fate may just be another name for the limits of our vision, and what we call freedom may be a flame flickering within those limits. The next step. To understand fate, one had to understand the self, and to understand the self, one had to ask, what is truth? What is justice? What is a good life? And so, our journey leads us to the man who asked those very questions, not in temples or scrolls, but in the streets. The man with nothing but questions. Socrates. Chapter 6. Socrates. Socrates is not a break in our journey through philosophy. He is its ignition point, a pivot from the outer cosmos to the inner life. Where earlier thinkers searched the skies and atoms, Socrates turned the gaze inward, into the soul. He forced humanity to ask not just what is the world made of, but how should we live inside it? And he did all this without writing a single word. He was a riddle, barefoot in the marketplace, wrapped in a ragged cloak, poor, unwashed, yet more radiant than any gold-adorned sophist. He was sharp, fearless, annoying, but above all, necessary. The paradox of knowing nothing. Socrates claimed he knew nothing. To many, this sounded like false humility, but he meant it literally. True knowledge to him wasn't piling up facts, it was understanding the limits of one's certainty. Athens was a city of experts. Poets, craftsmen, politicians, all sure of themselves. Socrates challenged that certainty. He asked simple questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is love? Not to trap them, but to help them see their contradictions. Someone might define justice as obeying the law, and Socrates would ask, what about unjust laws? The conversation would spiral, definitions collapse, assumptions unravel, the mask of knowledge torn away. He called this midwifery, not of children, but of thoughts. His role was not to teach, but to help others birth truth from within. This process, called the Socratic method, wasn't meant to humiliate. It was a spiritual practice, a cleansing of the intellect, a discipline of the soul. To be wise, Socrates insisted, was not to possess knowledge, but to love it. That's where we get the word philosopher, philosophia, the lover of wisdom. The Oracle of Delphi. The spark that ignited Socrates' mission came from an oracle. A friend once asked the Oracle of Delphi, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" The priestess replied, "No one." Socrates was stunned. He didn't think he was wise. So he investigated, interrogating poets, politicians, and artisans. One by one, he found they thought themselves wise but couldn't explain their beliefs. They knew how to speak, but not why. Socrates realized the oracle was right, not because he knew more, but because he was aware of his own ignorance. And this awareness gave him clarity. It lit a fire in him. He would spend the rest of his life testing the boundaries of knowledge, not to dominate others, but to help them awaken. The shift from nature to the soul. Before Socrates, philosophy asked, what is everything made of? Where does the sun go at night? What is motion? These were vital questions, but they ignored the chaos inside us. Socrates asked different questions. What is a good life? What makes an action just? Can virtue be taught? He believed that until we understood ourselves, we had no hope of understanding the universe. This marked a radical shift in human thought. He moved philosophy from the stars into the streets, from physics to ethics. He challenged the Athenians to stop admiring the external world and begin examining the inner one. The unexamined life. His most famous line was simple: "The unexamined life is not worth living." To live blindly, to drift through customs, traditions, and ideologies without questioning them, was, to Socrates, a betrayal of one's soul. He argued that the care of the soul mattered more than wealth, beauty, or even physical survival. To act unjustly, even for gain, harmed the soul. And since the soul is what defines us, it meant losing your very self. This wasn't theoretical, it was urgent. Every day in the Athenian square, Socrates treated each conversation like a matter of life and death, because to him it was. Socrates and Euthyphro. One of the clearest examples of Socratic dialogue comes from Plato's Euthyphro. Socrates is outside the courthouse, awaiting his trial. He meets a man named Euthyphro, who's prosecuting his own father for murder. Socrates asks him, "What is piety?" Euthyphro offers definitions, doing what the gods love, for instance. Socrates counters, "Do the gods all agree? If they disagree, then what pleases one may displease another. So is piety what all the gods love, or is it something independent of them?" The conversation spirals. Euthyphro becomes frustrated. No answer satisfies Socrates, not because he's being difficult, but because each answer leads to a deeper contradiction. What we see here is a perfect snapshot of Socratic philosophy. It's not about arriving at a conclusion, it's about waking up. Why he was hated. Socrates was disruptive. He exposed pretensions. He made the powerful look foolish. He didn't bow to tradition or authority. He questioned the gods. He questioned democracy. He questioned everything. He had followers, young men especially, who delighted in watching him dismantle the wisdom of their elders. The city saw this not as philosophy, but as corruption. Eventually, he was arrested and charged with 2 crimes: corrupting the youth, failing to believe in the gods of the city. He stood before a jury of 500 Athenians. His defense? Philosophy itself. He argued that he had only sought truth, that he was in fact a gift from the gods, a gadfly sent to sting the city awake. He could have begged, he could have fled, but he chose to stay. To him, philosophy was not just a career, it was a way of being, a moral compass. Death of a philosopher. He was sentenced to death. His friends arranged an escape, but Socrates refused. Breaking the law, even a bad law, would violate the very principles he stood for, so he drank the hemlock. Plato describes the moment. Socrates, calm and rational, surrounded by friends, continues to discuss the immortality of the soul until the poison numbs his limbs and his voice fades. His body died, but his idea lived. The legacy of doubt. Socrates left no books, no school, no treatise. Just a method, just a mindset, just the fire of a question that refuses to go out. His student Plato would carry that fire further into the metaphysical, the abstract, the world of ideals. But what Socrates gave us was deeper than logic. He gave us the courage to doubt, the courage to ask questions that don't have easy answers, the courage to live a life of examination, even when it hurts. Socrates didn't claim to know the truth, but he made knowing ourselves the highest goal of philosophy. The next step. As Socrates' questions echoed through the streets of Athens, the city itself became a living classroom. The next chapter dives deeper into Athens' intellectual legacy, where philosophy and politics intertwined to shape history. Chapter 7. Athens. Athens was not just a city, it was a question mark etched in stone, a living paradox. Democracy alongside slavery, philosophy beside war, art next to chaos. But most of all, Athens was a furnace of thought. If Socrates cracked open the soul, Athens built the theater to examine it. The city wasn't just a backdrop, it was a consciousness, a buzzing hive of ideas where every corner echoed with argument, poetry, ambition, and revolt. And every voice, whether powerful or poor, was forced to confront the same ancient challenge. How do we live together? This is where philosophy changed shape. No longer the solitary musings of nature-obsessed thinkers, it became dialogue, public, political, messy. Socrates walked here. Plato built academies here. Aristotle categorized the very essence of life here. And the city itself, it shaped their thought. The city as a mirror. Imagine standing in the Agora, the beating heart of ancient Athens. You're surrounded by traders, soldiers, philosophers, actors, slaves, and citizens. Ideas fly through the air like birds. There's no silence here, only argument, laughter, and law. This wasn't noise, it was process. The Athenian mind didn't just think, it tested. In courtrooms, theaters, and assembly halls, thoughts were spoken aloud, scrutinized, destroyed, or rebuilt. This wasn't just a form of communication. It was survival. In a true democracy, your ability to think clearly, argue well, and defend your beliefs was the difference between exile and influence. Every citizen was a thinker, not out of luxury but necessity. So the question arises, What does a city do to the mind of a philosopher? The pressure of the polis. Athenian democracy was radical for its time. It wasn't perfect. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded, but it still did something unprecedented. It made opinion matter. Every citizen was responsible for shaping the fate of the city. This wasn't abstraction, it was power. And with power came anxiety. You had to choose. Justice or vengeance, wisdom or rhetoric, war or peace. This constant decision-making didn't just shape policy, it reshaped how humans thought. It trained minds to ask, what is good? Not in theory, but in public, with consequences. And this pressure didn't break the philosophers, it sharpened them. It's no accident that Plato and Aristotle emerged here. The city made them restless. It gave them raw material, contradiction, conflict, suffering, hope. They didn't write in isolation. They wrote while watching the soul of a city tear itself apart trying to do the right thing. Democracy and doubt. Here's the irony. While Athens birthed democracy, its most famous thinkers didn't fully trust it. Socrates was executed by democratic vote. Plato, traumatized by that execution and the chaotic politics surrounding it, came to believe that truth couldn't be left to the masses. The majority, he thought, was too easily swayed by emotions, appearances, and clever rhetoric. And Aristotle? He sought balance. He believed in observation, moderation, and classification. But even he questioned whether democracy could survive without educated, virtuous citizens. Athens forced these questions into being. Without it, their philosophies would never have matured. The city, with all its chaos, was a proving ground. The philosopher's mind is not born in comfort, it is born under tension. And nowhere was that tension more visible than in the streets of Athens. Theater as thought. It wasn't just philosophy. Athens told stories that were more than entertainment. They were arguments dressed as tragedy. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, they turned the stage into a philosophical arena. One day, an Athenian might watch Socrates question the meaning of justice in the marketplace. The next day, he'd sit in the open-air theater watching Orestes wrestle with vengeance and fate. It was all connected. In Athens, myth was interrogated, gods were doubted, heroes were broken, no idea was sacred, not even the gods themselves. This wasn't blasphemy, it was courage. The Athenians knew that to live well meant to question deeply. Their myths weren't just preserved, they were challenged, dissected, reimagined. Thought becomes institution. Before Athens, wisdom was oral. After Athens, it became institutional. Plato opened his academy here, not a building, but a concept, a place where minds could gather to seek truth, not profit. Aristotle, Plato's student, would later found the Lyceum, his own school focused on categorization, biology, politics, and logic. If Plato dreamed of eternal forms, Aristotle dealt with tangible systems, but both were products of Athens. Their schools were responses to the city's intensity. They didn't flee from it. They structured it, formalized it, gave it shape. Athens forced the philosopher to organize chaos, and in doing so, philosophy itself evolved from poetic intuition into disciplined inquiry. Athens, the thought process externalized. So what was Athens? A city of contradictions. A place that gave the world the concept of freedom while holding slaves. A city that empowered its citizens and yet condemned one of its wisest to death. But in those contradictions, something rare happened. Philosophy became real. No longer a solitary thought experiment, but a shared civic duty. No longer a whisper in the forest, but a shout in the square. Athens was the mind turned outward, the soul externalized. Its thinkers were not just abstract dreamers. They were people trying to survive, to question, to imagine while the world watched. And that is what made it dangerous. That is what made it beautiful. The next step. Athens sharpened philosophy by exposing it to the raw machinery of society. The city wasn't a classroom, it was a crucible. But from this fire, Plato emerged, searching for something purer beyond the city's imperfection. A world of forms, a world of truth.
Before Plato, the world was a riddle of shifting appearances, where truth seemed to dissolve the moment you reached for it. But Plato dared to imagine something beyond the world, a reality that could not be touched, only understood. It all began with a question. How can we trust what we see? Socrates had taught the art of asking, of slicing open comfortable beliefs to reveal ignorance beneath. But Socrates left the world with no clear answers, only open wounds. Plato took those wounds and stitched them into something astonishing, a universe where true knowledge was possible, but only if you looked beyond your senses. The world of forms. To understand Plato, imagine this. You hold a gingerbread man. You can see it, smell it, break it in two, eat it. But is that gingerbread man truly unique? If you bake another and another, each one slightly different in shape, size, or how well the edges are browned, are any of these the perfect gingerbread man? Plato would say no. For Plato, the real gingerbread man doesn't exist in your kitchen or your hands or even your mouth. It exists in the world of forms, a place beyond time and space where the perfect gingerbread man lives. Every cookie you bake is merely an imperfect shadow of that perfect, invisible blueprint. This wasn't just about cookies, of course. Plato believed everything in our world is like this: chairs, trees, horses, justice, courage, love. We only see their temporary, broken reflections. The true essence, the unchanging, flawless form, can only be accessed through thought, not sight. And so, for Plato, philosophy wasn't a matter of observing the world. It was about escaping it. The allegory of the cave. Plato's most famous metaphor is perhaps the most haunting in all of philosophy. Imagine prisoners, chained from birth inside a dark cave. They are locked in place, staring at a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk by holding up objects. These objects cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners believe the shadows are reality. It's all they've ever known. The shapes on the wall are their truth, their world. Now imagine one prisoner breaks free. At first, the light burns his eyes. Reality is disorienting, even painful. But eventually, his sight adjusts, and he sees the world outside the cave, vivid, three-dimensional, real. If he returns to tell the others, would they believe him? Or would they call him mad? Plato used this story to explain the human condition. To him, most of us live like the prisoners, trapped in a world of sensory shadows, confusing reflections for truth. Philosophy was the art of breaking free. So what happens once you leave the cave? What happens once the shadows no longer control your mind? For Plato, the answer was simple but life-changing. Once you have seen the world of forms, you cannot return to your old beliefs. You become something else entirely. You become a philosopher. And to Plato, this wasn't just a personal journey, it was a mission. The philosopher had a duty to help others wake up. To him, the state, society, and the individual were all entangled in the same search for truth. The philosopher king. Plato believed society could only be truly just if it were ruled by someone who had left the cave, someone who had seen the forms, especially the highest form, the form of the good. This ideal leader, he argued, would not hunger for power like ordinary rulers, but would rule out of wisdom, with the sole aim of organizing society for the flourishing of all. A society ruled by such a person would mirror the harmony of the forms themselves. This was the core of his famous political idea, the philosopher king. But Plato's vision of justice wasn't limited to palaces and thrones. He believed even the human soul was a kind of miniature society, a system of parts that needed harmony. The tripartite soul. Plato imagined the soul as having three parts: reason, the thinking, rational mind; spirit, the willpower, courage, and emotion; appetite, the cravings, desires, and instincts. Just like a well-governed city, a well-governed soul places reason in charge, spirit as its loyal soldier, and appetite under discipline. If the wrong part rules, if appetite or emotion dominate, chaos ensues, both within the person and in society. For Plato, the pursuit of truth was both a personal and a political duty. To know yourself was to understand your place in the cosmic order. Knowledge is recollection. But perhaps Plato's most mind-bending idea was this: learning isn't about absorbing new information. It's about remembering. Plato believed that our souls existed long before our birth in the world of forms. When we are born into the material world, we forget. Our lives become an endless, painful attempt to remember what we already once knew. Philosophy, then, is not the act of learning. It's the art of recalling. This idea flips education on its head. Knowledge isn't handed to you. It's awakened from within. The form of good. If all of Plato's ideas could be strung together like pearls on a thread, the thread would be this: the good. Everything points toward it, and everything draws its meaning from it. In Plato's view, all things that exist, justice, beauty, courage, even knowledge itself, are illuminated and made possible by this mysterious, unshakable principle. It's not enough to know what something is. You must understand its purpose, its essence, and its ultimate place in the hierarchy of existence. And at the top of that hierarchy stands the good, like the sun in the sky, casting light so that all else can be seen. The allegory of the sun. In his dialogues, Plato compares the form of the good to the sun. Just as the sun allows the eye to see and the plants to grow, the good allows the mind to understand and reality to exist. Without the good, all other knowledge is blind. And so the thought process sharpens. What is the good? Plato never directly defines it. Instead, he suggests the good is the ultimate cause, the purest form of truth, beauty, and justice, but even these words fall short. The good is not merely something you can describe. It's something you must directly experience through contemplation and awakening. Philosophy, for Plato, was the ladder you climb toward this experience. And as the philosopher climbs higher, leaving behind the world of shadows, logic, and opinion, the light of the good becomes so blinding that the mind can do nothing but stand in awe. Love is a path to truth. But how do we begin this climb? Plato believed that love, or eros, plays a crucial role. To him, love isn't just romance or attraction. Love is the longing for beauty, the pull toward perfection. In his dialogue, The Symposium, he describes a journey, now called the ladder of love. First, you fall in love with a single beautiful body. Then you realize beauty exists in all bodies. Next, you begin to love the beauty of the mind. Finally, you ascend to the love of beauty itself, the form. This isn't about falling in love with a person. It's about falling in love with truth. Love, in its deepest form, is the human soul's desire to return to the world of forms, to awaken from the illusion of the senses. The legacy of Plato's thought. Plato's impact on philosophy and society cannot be overstated. His ideas formed the foundation for Western thought, influencing not only philosophers, but also political theorists, scientists, and religious thinkers. His dialogues, filled with the Socratic method of questioning, continue to be studied and debated today. His vision of the ideal society, governed by wisdom, not power, remains a powerful model for those seeking justice in an imperfect world. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Plato's philosophy is his belief in the power of reason to uncover truth, to dispel illusion, and to guide humanity toward a better world.
Chapter 9. Hellenism. There are moments in human history when ideas collide, not like swords in battle, but like stars in the night sky, separate lights until one day their gravity pulls them together. This is the world of Hellenism, a time when Greek thought spilled beyond the walls of Athens, and ideas no longer belonged to one city, one people, or even one way of thinking. It was the dawn of something new, and yet something deeply human. The search for meaning in a world without walls. When Alexander the Great set out to conquer the world, he didn't just bring soldiers and steel. He carried with him something far more enduring: Greek philosophy. By the time the dust of his empire settled, the known world wasn't Greek or Persian or Egyptian anymore. It was all three, and none of them. This was the Hellenistic era, a melting pot of cultures, religions, and ideas. And for the wandering minds of that age, the old certainties of Plato and Aristotle no longer fit neatly into place. The world had grown larger, and so had the questions. The philosophers of this time asked not, "What is the perfect state?" but rather, "How can I find peace in an unpredictable world?" A shift from the political to the personal, from the collective to the self. And three great schools would rise to answer that question. First came the Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium. The Stoics believed that the universe was governed by reason, a divine law they called the Logos. According to them, everything happens as it must. You, me, every leaf on the wind, part of a grand, unbreakable chain of cause and effect. And if you cannot change the world, the only thing left is to change yourself. The Stoics taught the art of apatheia, not apathy as we know it, but a calm, unshakable acceptance of fate. Joy and sorrow, wealth and poverty, life and death, all things the wise person greets without fear or desire. In a world of chaos, the Stoic finds order within. But not all sought mastery over emotion. Some sought to escape it entirely. Enter Epicurus. The Epicureans believed the goal of life was pleasure, but not the kind you find at the bottom of a wine glass or in the fleeting warmth of luxury. Epicurus taught that true pleasure was the absence of pain, the stillness of fear, particularly the fear of gods and the fear of death. Why worry about the gods if they are indifferent? Why fear death if it is simply nothing? In this way, Epicurus offered his students peace, a quiet garden of thought walled against the storms of the outside world. And then there were the skeptics. For every belief, the skeptics asked, "How can you be sure?" Every argument was met with another question. Every truth met with doubt. They believed that certainty was a trap and that freedom lay in suspension. When you stopped believing too strongly in anything, you stopped suffering for it. In a world built on shifting sands, the skeptic built nothing and stood firmly on open ground. So, which path would you choose? Would you train your mind to accept the world as it is, like the Stoics? Would you seek calm pleasure in the present moment, like the Epicureans? Or would you abandon certainty altogether, like the skeptics? Each of these schools was not just a philosophy, but a survival strategy for a world that had lost its old gods and found no new ones. But Hellenism was not just about human happiness. It was also about bridges. Bridges between cultures, between philosophies, between heaven and earth. As Greek thought met Eastern mysticism, ideas about gods and the cosmos began to blend. New religions were born, old ones transformed. And then in the eastern corner of the empire, a new belief emerged, destined to change the world even more profoundly: Christianity. At first glance, it seems a world apart from Plato's forms or Aristotle's logic. But in truth, Christianity was shaped by the intellectual winds of the Hellenistic world, the idea of a divine logos, the Stoic mind behind the universe, the promise of eternal life, the call for virtue, the ethical foundation laid by Socrates and sharpened by the Stoics. Hellenism did not erase the old world. It absorbed it, reshaped it, and handed it forward, piece by piece. This is the quiet truth of history. Empires crumble, but ideas migrate. And the Hellenistic age was the grand migration of thought, from Athens to Alexandria to Rome and beyond. A new world had begun to form. A world where Greek reason and Eastern faith would meet, clash, and ultimately shape the future. And so the wandering mind of the philosopher did not die with Athens. it became something else, something borderless, something eternal. A quiet reminder that even in the darkest of times, the search for meaning never ends. In the next chapter, we'll take a closer look at one of the most influential figures in history and philosophy, Jesus. His teachings will provide a unique intersection between Greek thought and emerging spiritual ideologies, leading us into the most profound shift in the philosophical landscape. In the long, winding path of human history, certain ideas arrive like a lightning bolt, cutting through the fog of custom, war, and survival. When they first appear, they don't simply ask for attention, they demand it. They reshape the human heart. One such moment in history came not with a sword, not with a new empire, but with a strange and quiet figure walking the dusty roads of Judea. A carpenter's son, a man named Jesus. To understand the philosophy of two cultures, we have to step into a world torn between two enormous forces. The Greek worldview, reason, logic, inquiry, and the Jewish worldview, obedience, covenant, and faith in one God. It's in the collision of these two cultures that something extraordinary happened. Something that didn't just alter religious belief, but changed the very framework of how we think about right, wrong, and what it means to be human. And at the center of it all stood Jesus. When people in the ancient world thought about power, they imagined kings on horses, emperors in chariots, and warriors with swords raised high. Conquerors demanded loyalty. The old world taught that strength ruled the day. But then came a new king, not the kind you'd expect. No army marched behind him. No crown of gold sat on his head. Instead, he entered the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. The symbol wasn't lost on anyone. In ancient tradition, horses represented conquest and war, but a donkey was the animal of the humble, an animal of peace. The old prophecies, like those from Zechariah, spoke of this moment, but the reality of it, the quiet defiance of what power looked like, was deeply strange, almost absurd. But it was this strangeness that made the moment unforgettable. And with Jesus' arrival came another even stranger idea, an idea that would stand as one of the most radical moral proposals the world had ever heard. Love thy neighbor as thyself. A simple sentence. But behind those words lay a thought process that demanded an entirely new way of seeing the world. In the ancient world, loyalty and care were usually confined to bloodlines, tribes, or nations. You loved your family, you defended your people, you might respect your allies. But neighbor was often a limited term. It referred to those within your circle, the safe, the familiar, the deserving. But Jesus shattered that boundary. To love your neighbor wasn't just about affection or kindness. It was a call to action, a way of living that placed empathy at the very core of human behavior. And as the parable of the Good Samaritan would later reveal, neighbor didn't mean your friend, your family, or even your countryman. It meant anyone, especially the outsider, especially the stranger. This was not common thinking. This was a complete reversal. And this is where the two cultures meet. The Greeks had taught the world about logos, reason, order, the underlying structure of the universe. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had spent their lives chasing truth through logic, debate, and observation. Truth was seen as something abstract, almost mathematical, impersonal, something you reached through the mind. But in the Hebrew worldview, truth was deeply personal. It was bound up in relationships between God and humanity, between humans and one another. The Hebrew scriptures told stories of covenant and commitment, of obedience to a higher will, of walking humbly with God. And when Jesus stepped into history, he didn't reject either path. He fulfilled both. The Gospel of John, written decades later, opens with a deeply philosophical line. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek word for word here is logos, the same logos that Plato believed structured the universe, the same logos the Stoics believed held the cosmos together. But now, logos was not an abstract formula. It had become flesh. It walked among people. It healed the sick, comforted the broken, and challenged the self-righteous. This was a profound thought process. That ultimate reality, the logic behind the cosmos, wasn't some distant equation or cold principle. It was a person. And the more you reflect on this, the more revolutionary it becomes. Imagine a world built on competition, strength, and hierarchy. A world where the strong survive and the weak submit. That was the world Jesus was born into. Rome controlled the land. Soldiers enforced the peace, the so-called Pax Romana, through the sword. But Jesus didn't teach his followers to conquer their enemies. He taught them to turn the other cheek. He told them to pray for those who persecute you. He even went so far as to tell them to forgive 70 times 7 times. These weren't the sayings of a warrior or a politician. They were the thought patterns of someone who had seen a different world entirely, a world beyond human power. And so the idea of two cultures isn't simply about Greece and Jerusalem. It's about two ways of thinking. One, the pursuit of knowledge, wisdom, and rationality. The other, the pursuit of relationship, love, and faith. Jesus' arrival didn't just bridge the gap. It created a new foundation, a synthesis, a worldview where knowledge wasn't enough without compassion, and where compassion wasn't blind, but rooted in truth. It was the beginning of something new, something world-altering. And here's something worth thinking about. Both Jesus and Socrates shared a strange and haunting parallel. Both men walked the streets, not to command armies or build empires, but to challenge the minds of those around them. Both disturbed the authorities of their day, not with violence, but with ideas. And both were sentenced to death for it. It's no coincidence that these two figures, one from the heart of Athens, the other from the hills of Galilee, were seen as threats to the social order. What Socrates did for philosophy, Jesus did for human ethics. Both encouraged people to question the world around them, to seek truth beyond tradition, and to embrace a higher moral calling, even if it meant facing the scorn of the crowd. But the real question is, why did these two peaceful thinkers have to die? Why was it that when someone held a mirror to human nature, one reflecting reason, the other reflecting love, the world shattered the mirror instead of changing its reflection? Perhaps the answer lies not in the logic of the age, but in the fear of change. Both men threatened to undo the comfort of false certainty, and for that, both were condemned. The story of Jesus wasn't merely another chapter in history. It was a turning point in the human thought process, an axis around which Western culture would slowly begin to rotate. You see, when Jesus spoke of loving your neighbor as yourself, he wasn't offering polite advice for personal growth. He was introducing a radical new ethic, one that required human beings to view others, not as obstacles, enemies, or tools, but as reflections of their own sacred worth. This wasn't a moral system rooted in self-preservation, nor was it a strategy for success in the ancient world's brutal political games. It was a philosophy grounded in sacrifice, the type of love that was willing to lose, to forgive, to serve. Even as the Roman world stood tall on its architecture, law, and military might, the quiet idea that love was greater than force was beginning to seep into human consciousness. This thought process, the fusion of Greek reason and Jewish faith, would linger like a seed planted deep into the soil of Western civilization. Philosophers after Jesus would wrestle with it for centuries. Thinkers like Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas wouldn't simply discard Greek logic, nor would they abandon the Hebrew scriptures. Instead, they attempted something far more ambitious, a synthesis. Could faith and reason live together? Could the Greek mind, with its love of order, precision, and rational debate, coexist with the Hebrew heart, with its deep trust in revelation, relationship, and mystery? The coming centuries would be spent trying to answer that question, and it wouldn't happen in a day, or even a lifetime. So what, in the end, did these two cultures teach us? From Greece, we inherited our tools for understanding the universe: philosophy, science, mathematics, democracy. From Jerusalem, we inherited our understanding of meaning: covenant, love, justice, mercy. The real breakthrough was realizing these two paths weren't enemies, but two sides of the same human question. What is truth? What is good? And how should we live? When Jesus stood before Pilate, a Roman governor, a man of law and politics, the question wasn't about military power or empire or even survival. The question, chillingly simple, was, what is truth? Pilate asked the question. Jesus had already lived the answer. As centuries rolled forward, this fusion would be tested in ways the early followers of Jesus could scarcely imagine. Empires would rise and fall. The Roman world, once thought eternal, would crumble. But the ideas, the thought processes, would remain. And as Rome's sun began to set, a new era dawned. The Middle Ages. An age where faith would dominate the intellectual landscape, and yet the ancient Greek thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, and the rest, would be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reabsorbed into Christian philosophy. It was a time of cathedrals and monasteries, of illuminated manuscripts and silent cloisters, of knights and monks. A world where the two cultures would not only coexist, they would build the very foundations of the European mind. But that is a thought for another day.